Alrighty. So this is going to be a first attempt to do one of these videos. So these videos are going to be a series of discussing some more in-depth strategy with Kings of War stuff that I would normally want to write like a fairly substantial blog post on. However, me not being someone who has the time to type anymore, I figured it would be easier to record a 30-minute video kind of expressing my thoughts and also showing examples using Universal Battles. If you have not seen Universal Battles, this is what it looks like. It's just basically a simulator that you can use online to play Kings of War and various other miniatures games. We're going to be using that to basically look at some of the common questions that I hear asked about Kings of War or asked in Kings of War that don't really have a straight answer. A lot of times I'll hear people ask, like, how do you do these things? And the answer is, well, it's situational. And so I wanted to kind of go over some of these situations in a series of videos and talk about how to play Kings better with a little bit more specific examples. So the first video, as indicated by the title, ideally, is going to be 25.4, and that is discussing the main thing we're going to discuss is why 25.4 is such an important number in Kings, how that affects your deployment, how that affects your formations, how that affects your movement, how that affects positioning between enemy units, and most importantly, how it applies to corkscrews, which seem to be a topic that a lot of people don't fully understand why. So, without further ado, we're going to discuss what is 25.4, what does that number actually mean, and how it applies to different things. Starting off, 25.4 is the amount of millimeters in an inch. Kings is a very odd game that uses two separate measurement systems, so it uses both the metric system and the imperial system. So the imperial system being 1 inch, we move in inches, we measure in inches, we check ranges in inches. However, the size of units is in the metric system. Why it's not one unified system the whole way through, I'm not sure. But ultimately, that means we get interesting situations where we have conversions, where we have to convert the metric system to the imperial system or vice versa. And the important difference there is that an inch in the imperial system is 25.4 millimeters in the metric system. That number is critical because it determines how units can turn, and is there space between units. One of the most common rules in the game, or one of the most common things that you could do, at least currently, the current FAQ aside, usually this would be a common thing. We saw it in 2nd edition, we see it moving into 3rd, is the 1 inch withdraw move. So whenever you're fighting a combat, you pull back 1 inch, and that 1 inch allows you to basically maneuver either to the left, right, by either sidestepping, you can back up further, but most importantly, what people tend to do with it is they tend to charge a different unit or corkscrew. This is typically seen as one of the main attributes of Kings. Some people don't like it because they see it as not realistic or not historical. Ultimately, Kings is a game first and then battle simulator second, so that's why this number is important. So what does that actually mean? Why is 25.4 important for withdrawing? Well, when you withdraw from an enemy unit, you withdraw exactly 1 inch. Again, using the imperial system, so you're backing up 1 inch, not more than 1 inch. Because we're backing up an inch, at that point, what we've given ourselves is 25.4 millimeters of space. Now, this is important because King's units are on square bases. So everything has a center point, and from that center point there is a specific measurement of how far apart the sides of the base are from your center. So if we look at all of these units that I've lined up on the screen here, we can see that they're all various sizes of units in Kings. The common theme of all of these units is that they will be no wider than 50 millimeters compared to how deep they are. And we're going to go across and actually check that just so that you can see the difference. So over here you have your standard individual on a 20 by 20. Technically I could have put another 25 by 25 individual beside him, but they're basically the same thing for all intents and points. Anything on a square base is obviously going to fit this parameter because it is the same wide as it is long. Wide as it is deep, I should say. So you've got a mounted individual who is in fact thinner than he is deep. Then you've got regular infantry, large infantry character, monstrous character, Titan character. All of these are on squares, so they all fit the parameters. Chariots are again thinner than they are deep. Then we start getting into the interesting ones. So these are the ones that people tend to not know exactly which units can, and again, I'll show the math on this here in a second, but we have a regular infantry regiment. A large infantry regiment is the same as a cav unit, so I haven't put them here, for example, but they would be the same parameters. They are, in fact, 125 millimeters wide by 100 deep. So at that point, you're 25 millimeters wider than you are deep. Large infantry are going to be 120 by 80. Monstrous infantry are going to be 150 by 100. This is the longest you can be at 50 millimeters, so wider than you are deep. This applies to both chariot regiments as well as large cavalry. And then you have chariot hordes, which are again another anomaly, being longer than they are wide. So how this actually works is that when two units... Let me get this guy turned around here. So how this actually works is when two units start opposing each other, and you withdraw exactly 1 inch, as we see here. We have withdrawn 1 inch. Now, when you pivot, you pick up a unit, and you transplant it exactly 90 degrees. So, because of that, what you're effectively doing is taking this measurement, which I'm going to show just by putting an arrow across here. In fact, I might actually borrow one of my... Here we go, I'm just going to borrow this. For example, this video is well planned, as you can see. Now, this is not a perfect measurement, but this right here is approximately 1.5 inches across, so technically it should be a little bit more than that, but this measurement here from the center of the unit to the back of the unit, so is going to be, in this case, it should be 40 millimeters. Going from the center to the side should be 60 millimeters, because that's the difference in either direction. Now, because of that, you're gaining, so when we do a perfect 90-degree pivot, we are effectively adding 20 millimeters, the difference between 40 and 60, to our front, so this side of the base. So when we do our 90-degree pivot here, there should be approximately, now that we've added the 20 millimeters, there should be 5.4 millimeters in between us and this enemy base. When you go 50 millimeters wide, the widest you can possibly get while doing this, this difference will be exactly 0.4 millimeters, this 0.4 gap. What this allows you to do is a whole number of things. One, this allows you to do the tried and true corkscrew charge. So if you back up and can see this unit over here, you move forward, you charge, you have now completed a corkscrew. So, as it is so commonly called, or commonly called, I should say. You can also do nimble maneuvers to get out of there. So if you had the ability to nimble charge using height differences, so we say we back up here and we see the Molochs, we would then pivot once, move, pivot twice, and with nimble make the connection, like so. This would be what is known as the nimble corkscrew. It gets extra juicy when you manage to get a flank with it. Obviously, there are easy ways to counter this. Be aware of what your opposing units can do, understand where they can move, and you can do stuff like either make sure this unit is prepared to take that charge, in this case the fence is going to help them out quite a bit, or prepare traps in addition to that. So there are more things you can do with this, however, and it's also important to understand how it works with your own units. So one thing that I see a lot of people struggle with right now is how to use units to cover other units. So with here, I'm going to show two different examples of two different chaff pieces being approximately 1 inch apart from this horde. And basically how that interacts with this horde and what you can do to basically take the maximum advantage of your chaff pieces. So if we see here, we have the unit of scavengers blocking off the front of the skeleton horde. The benefit here for players would be to force an opponent that wants to charge the skeletons to charge only this side. And assuming the skeletons do not break, which most units in the game should not be able to break a horde in one turn regardless of what they are, Soul Reavers probably being the one exception, the scavengers could then move out of the way. Technically, they don't even have to move out of the way. They could just charge the flank of the cav, in this case, along with the skeletons. This unit does need to move out of the way for that to happen so that the skeletons can form correctly. In this case, this is too close, because these are 140. So 1 inch apart will not do it. You need to be slightly further apart. Because the difference here, because you are so wide, here we have 40 millimeters, so it's a 20 millimeter difference here, versus 60 on the sides, so you're gaining 40 millimeters, which is too much. So you actually want to be about 1.5 inches apart from your units in the front. This allows you to complete a pivot. Just doing the quick math in my head, 20 millimeters, half of that, 10. Yes, this should be plenty. And then you would scoot forward. And now you have room to maneuver the skeletons. If you want to be extra cautious with it, keep it a 2-inch gap. I would keep it about 1.5 inches. I believe that's the correct math. 40 millimeter difference. No, it would need to be a little bit further, probably 1.75 inches. So, inch, and that's about as close to 3/4. Yep, there we go. The reason you don't want to go too far back is if you get 2 inches, you can now allow a flying 50 millimeter monster to get through. So you want to keep it tighter than 2 inches wide, but not far enough, not too close to where you can't pivot to maneuver out of the way. So here, by knowing exactly how far back you need to be, you can position your units better, you can maneuver them a little bit cleaner, and this will allow you to trap your own lines in situations like this where we need to perform this flank charge. It may also catch your opponent off guard when you do things like this, where you can now unshuffle your units in situations they didn't expect you to be able to unshuffle your units. So just understanding where you need to put stuff to do that is very important. On the contrary, and this is another reason why this unit also needs to be further forward, for the same reasons, this unit gets a little tricky, because you want it to be far enough forward that, let's say something charges it, that theoretically it can back up. Now with this type of chaff piece, that won't work. With scavengers, because they're so wide, you wouldn't be able to back up and pivot in any way, shape, or form. So you're not getting to get out of the situation. However, in situations where there isn't something here, you want them to, again, be about 1.75 inches ahead of whatever unit they're trying to cover. This, again, prevents flying monsters from getting in there, while still allowing them to pivot and move somewhere else where needed. But if you're using something that isn't a longer piece like this as chaff, so say you're using a giant or another infantry regiment, you want to make sure that you have enough room behind you after you back up to complete a pivot. So if there's something where you want to do in the best case scenario, where you're trying to prevent a multi-charge on the skeletons, but also allow yourself to get a multi-charge in the following turn. Let's see, positioning here gets a little tricky. We'd have to start at the front of the skeletons. 1 inch is the minimum, so we need to be... This won't work with 150 millimeter wide units, because they'll end up touching the unit when they back up. Because again, you don't want to leave more than a 50 millimeter gap here to prevent flyers from getting in. So you can do 3.5 inches forward, or in this case, sorry, 1.75 inches forward, which allows you to back up your full 1 inch, pivot, and theoretically charge something that is here. This is less beneficial, mostly because these units won't be able to see the things next to them. It's more beneficial if there's something going on this side of the board. However, if it's a big unit, like a Chariot Legion, for example, Chariot Legion would be able to get caught out by this, because you would be able to see it over here in the corner. And again, the skeletons can just basically do a regular old straight charge into the flank by just walking forward and then wrapping around the corner. So you don't actually have to hit this side, you just have to hit this corner, and because the corner is part of both facings, you just have to be in contact with it. So you just declare a charge, and because you're now in the flank, you are now in the flank. Again, the Soul Reavers wouldn't be here in this case, but you could also do it in such a way... Let's back up a bit here. I might not have enough undos, but you could just literally do this like this. And the added benefit of this is that by having a regiment cover here, you now have cav in the front. These cav now, when they countercharge, will be in the front of the skeletons, so they won't themselves be able to perform a flank, whereas the flank of the skeletons is covered and cannot be touched by anything on this side. This maneuver right here, I think, is one that a lot of new players just don't quite understand how to perform. And it's one that is a really, really good one to pick up. I don't really think there's a name for it so much as it's just you cover one flank of a horde and then use the horde's natural width to allow a flank charge. This is also just good in general because hordes typically, because they have a wider frontage, tend to invite more multi-charges into them. And multi-charges are usually what hordes don't want to see because that's what can actually pick them up in one turn. And they are, in fact, a little bit more vulnerable to that than regiments are because regiments typically can do things that prevent them, like turning their flanks a little bit. In fact, I'll go ahead and show that here. So in most cases where you would want to double charge a regiment, you can do something like this with your units, and now you can only fit one unit here, or you can only fit one unit here, theoretically. The cav actually have enough frontage to where you could get a second one in here, at least with Enslaved Guardians. However, there are exceptions to this. If you have a character on this side, then you could still potentially double charge the regiment, because with Nimble you could sneak in there and then the Enslaved Guardians would have to pivot. This gets a little tricky to measure out, but ultimately this is a good way to help protect the flanks of your units. And in this case, depending on where this guy is, if you put him in a flank, he can't get here at all. Which is probably going to be a good spot to wrap up this episode. There are a lot of ways that this gap can be measured out and checked. There are a lot of different things to check with it. I'm probably going to do an entire episode on chariot characters to talk about how they can use the disengage rules to avoid a lot of these problems. But ultimately, there are a whole lot of different ways to use this gap to position your units better and therefore understand how you can move and not get into situations where you're bumping up against your other units and can't back up or move or position anymore. It's also important, and I guess this will be a way to wrap this up, is how to use this against your opponents. Typically, and again, this is less about you making correct moves and more about your opponent making a mistake and you punishing that mistake. So in this case, if your opponent is doing this, where they're incorrectly putting this unit right here, now you can slam into this unit and slam into the spears. Actually, this does not work with Soul Reavers, because Soul Reavers would actually be a good unit to do this with, theoretically, because in this situation you could back up the spears and then do a corkscrew with the Soul Reavers. However, you can't currently because you can't back up the full inch. Also, due to the current way the withdrawal rule works, you can't withdraw these guys at all because these guys are too close. Something that hopefully will get fixed relatively soon. On the flip side, let's see, where's a situation which is more likely to be punished? Is not going to be with Soul Reavers, but rather with a regular chaff piece. A lot of times what I see is people play their chaff like this. So when the chaff is positioned like so, let's say we do this double charge. Well, now the problem is that if this chaff piece is still there, at the end of the turn, which, depending on what you throw into it, is a good chance that it would. So like in this situation, I would throw my own chaff piece here against these scavengers. In this case, probably Revcav like a troop. The Revcav won't kill these, but now the skeletons, because there's not enough space anymore, can't complete a flank and must countercharge here, therefore removing the possibility they had to do the forced flank. Sometimes your opponent will rely on you to break these, and so the best thing to do is to not to break them. There are gonna be situations where units that are too clustered suddenly can't maneuver the way they want to. This is extremely important against Surge. Even just understanding that if a situation like this, as long as you do not provide a corkscrew opportunity for the unit that you have engaged, any unit that is not on a square base cannot back up and pivot to be surged, because they would end their pivot within an inch of another unit. As long as they are wider than they are deep, which is anything that's not on a square base, there are no units in this game that shamble that are not also on a wide base, excluding the Bone Giant and Bone Dragon in EOD, and the Grotesque in Undead, and that is intentional. That's why those monsters are surgeable. I also should give more credit to the Behemoth in EOD who is on a Chariot base. Again, I'm going to talk about Chariot bases in a whole different episode. But in any case, just these types of pins, this forcing your opponent to back up that inch but not be able to complete their pivot, help work on preventing these types of moves. So with that, I'm probably going to wrap up this episode. It's going to start getting long-winded, and I'm going to trail off into different subjects that I don't want to, and I'm trying to keep it as cohesive as I can here. Again, the main purpose of this is to just show how to space your units out and what they matter, and how that matters. So, with that said, if you enjoy this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm going to do the recordings on Twitch, so if people have questions, I'll answer them during the recording. And then moving forward, if this is something that becomes more popular, if people want to suggest topics to cover or questions that I could cover in this format, just let me know. All right.